The ventilation was terrible. I was just a little bit late getting to the service. I had been so busy all week with hours and hours of work, and then squeezing in as many opportunities as I could to hear Paul teach and preach. I raced from work to the service even though I was beyond exhausted. So I slipped in, hoping no one would notice that I was a little late. First, I sat on one of the benches, but it was just a little too uncomfortable. I noticed a nice spot next to the window. I quietly slipped over toward the window and sat where I could rest my back and get a breath of fresh air. I pulled up my knees under my chin and was comfortable at last. What a mistake that was. Fatigue settled in, and Paul preached on. The poor lights and inadequate ventilation started to have an effect on me, and Paul preached on. He was so enthusiastic and charismatic, but still my eyelids grew heavy as lead, and my head bobbed, and Paul preached on. Finally, the muscles in my body totally relaxed, and I was sound asleep. And Paul preached on. He seemed completely oblivious to the approaching midnight hour. Paul preached on and on. And the next thing I knew, I was on the ground surrounded by people with very concerned looks on their faces and by Paul himself. Some said I had fallen to my death and Paul resurrected me. Others said that the wind was knocked out of me and that Paul helped me to catch my breath again. All I know is that it was the most embarrassing moment of my life. And it was recorded for all eternity, in the Holy Scriptures, no less. So I'd watch out if I were you. When you're in worship, keep your eyes open.
So, at the very least, from the story of Eutychus, it's very clear that people have been falling asleep in worship pretty much since the Christian church began. And people have been falling asleep in church ever since. I grew up in Colorado, and I heard the story about frontier churches out in the West, and how there was a deacon in those frontier churches that used what was called the tithing man's rod. It was a rod that had on one end a knob and on the other a foxtail. And the deacon would stand in the back of the church, and if he noticed someone was starting to nod off or started to hear the sound of some snoring, he would decide which end of the pole to use, or the rod to use, in order to nudge the person and restore them back to life. So this picture actually is from New England, so it seems like there's something similar. I couldn't find one that represented the frontier church. And then in 2010, there was a seminarian who published an article about a time when he was asked to be the guest evangelist at revival meetings in Northeast Oklahoma. And he was really thrilled to have this opportunity to preach. But every evening as he started the service, he noticed there was a gentleman that came in his overalls, and they were slightly dirty, so he was probably coming straight from work. But he would sit in the very back pew. But as soon as that young preacher began to preach, within the first couple of the words, the man was in that back pew sound asleep. And the young preacher said he tried not to be insulted by what was going on because the man was trying to be encouraging. At the end of every worship service, as he walked out of the sanctuary or out of the revival meeting, he would go up to the young preacher and say, "Wow, I enjoyed every minute." But the preacher said, "I'm sure he enjoyed every minute of his very good nap." So, if only Eutychus could have known that he was not going to be the one and only napper in church for all time. Because I do sort of feel sorry for Eutychus. He was pretty hard on himself, especially as that monologue Brian read. He was pretty tough on himself. But rather than being the one and only napper in church, it seems instead that actually Eutychus was the forerunner, the pioneer of those who would be napping in church, that time-honored tradition. So let's spend a couple of minutes with Eutychus and his story. Maybe we can even redeem his reputation a little bit, because I think there's some very good things for us to learn from Eutychus' story. And at first, at least, there are two very simple messages that I think are glaringly apparent. So it is true. Eutychus went to worship that evening, and he fell asleep. But maybe instead of criticizing Eutychus for having fallen asleep, maybe he should be commended because he showed up. If he was really that tired, if he was really that exhausted, don't you think he was sorely tempted to just go home, call it a day, and crawl into bed? And yet, instead, Eutychus, for some reason, he felt so drawn to go to worship that night, to hear the charismatic Apostle Paul preach, and to be with his church family. He must have been so tempted by his exhaustion just to go home, but instead, he made a choice to do what he thought was best for him, best for his faith, best for his life, best for his soul, and to ignore that exhaustion and go to church. Scholars have noted that the name Eutychus was actually a very common name for slaves, and that often the Christian church, the early Christian church, held worship in the evening so that slaves could attend the service after their day's work was done and their masters were in bed. So it's very possible that Eutychus had spent a hard day of work, and then he was exhausted, but he made the decision, I think what's best for me is to go to worship, and so he went. That's commendable, because we all know that sometimes it's pretty hard to do what's best for ourselves, to make those good decisions. Steve Bloom, in an article entitled "Why It's So Hard to Do Good Things for Ourselves," analyzes how people make decisions. And he notes that often people place a premium on immediate benefits as opposed to those long-term benefits. So that people, if they're offered $50 now or $100 in a year, more people will take that $50 now than the $100 in a year. And how often does it happen that people are in bed and the alarm goes off and it's time to get up and go to the gym, but instead of going to the gym, that immediate benefit of rolling over and staying safe and warm and having a few more minutes of sleep, that's the benefit that we go for. So Bloom has said that there are some strategies to address this built-in desire for immediate benefits as opposed to long-term, one he calls the commitment device. And so if you make a commitment that you are going to get up 3 times a week and go to the gym or go for a walk or go jogging, then you commit yourself to that, and that if you do not live up to that commitment, then you pay a friend $10 each time you don't live up to that commitment. So what do you think would happen if on Sunday mornings you had to pay $50 if you decided to go to the beach or stay in bed rather than come to worship? Who knows? But Eutychus, He made the decision to do what was best for himself, a decision that's not always easy for us to make. Instead of going with the short-term benefit of going home and having a nap, he went for the long-term benefit for his heart and his soul, and he went to worship. So I think in that way, Eutychus can serve as a role model for all of us. But it's also true that Eutychus went to church that night, and he fell asleep. He fell sound asleep. But again, rather than criticizing Eutychus, maybe there's a message for preachers and for churches in that story. Because the scripture says, Paul preached, and he preached, and he preached, and he preached, and he seemed rather oblivious to what was going on with the people that were listening to him. And so perhaps there is a message in there for those of us who are preachers and those of us who are in the church about how we present the gospel message. Because it seems pretty important that we present the gospel message in such a way that it is engaging and that it is inviting to others. The message of the gospel, now that doesn't change. The message of the good news of Jesus Christ, the message of God's unending love, that doesn't change. But what can always change is how that message is presented and how to make it more inviting. And so we as a church, we have been working on that. We have a screen. We work with our music program all the time. We offer the message in kayaks and canoes and in the park and in the common. I also remember really early on in my time here, I was told by a family that after worship each Sunday at Sunday dinner, each person in the family had to say one thing that they had heard or they had learned from the sermon. Now that was a moment when I realized that worship had to really try to grab the attention of children, youth, adults, and seniors, and that crafting my sermons, I really need to think about, is it inviting and is it engaging to others? And so at the very least, the story of Eutychus is a tale that's important for us to hear, that it's important to be engaging and inviting in how we present the gospel message. So those are the two pretty simple, pretty easy to gain lessons from Eutychus' story. One, that it's commendable to make choices that are good for us, even when that's difficult. And two, that as preachers and as a church, we need to constantly be revisiting how we present the message of the gospel so that it's inviting and engaging. But there is another message that's maybe just below the surface of the story, another dimension to it that's maybe a little bit more symbolic or somewhere deeper within it. Because the story goes that Eutychus went to church. He fell asleep. He fell out of a window. And people thought he was dead, but more than likely it was that the wind was knocked out of him. That happens sometimes, isn't it? Eutychus was just living his life, doing what he normally did. And then an accident befell him, and the wind was knocked out of him. His breath was taken away. That can happen to any of us. We're going through our lives, we're living our daily lives, and an unexpected crisis, an unexpected difficulty comes into our lives. And it's like the breath is just knocked out of us. We can't breathe. We're flat on our backs. And we feel like we have no power at all. And at those times, we might feel like we're abandoned by God. We want to run away from God. We're angry at God. Or we feel so alone in our pain that we want other people just to leave us alone and we push them out. And we're isolated until we realize that it's in relationship with God, who can handle our anger and will be faithful to us, and it's in relationship with others that we will have our breath restored. So here is some Japanese characters. My Japanese isn't all that great, but on your right here, that is the symbol for person, and then this symbol here is for prisoner. And so we see that there is a person in a box. Sometimes when we have those moments, when an unexpected difficulty or crisis comes into our lives, that's how we feel. We're like a person in a box. We feel like no one can understand what's happening to us. No one can understand our unique pain. We feel like people don't want to be near us. We feel like God has left us all alone. When we sense that someone is experiencing that kind of isolation, that kind of difficulty, that the breath has been taken out of their lives, it behooves us to try to take down those walls and welcome those people into relationship with God and to one another so that healing can begin. There's a psychologist and family therapist, Dr. Dan Gottlieb. He used to have a weekly program on one of the national public radio stations called Voices in the Family. Now, he's someone who experienced having the wind knocked out of his life. He was in a tragic accident. He was traveling on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and he was going east, and a truck was going west. And that truck not only lost its tire, it lost the entire wheel, and it bounced over several lanes of traffic, and it crushed Gottlieb's car. And from that moment on, he was paralyzed from his chest down. So he is now a quadriplegic. So soon after that accident, Gottlieb began to write a book called Letters to Sam, letters to his grandson. Because Gottlieb, having experienced his own sense of mortality, and because his health was now at greater risk, wanted to write these letters to his grandson in case he wasn't around when his grandson was old enough to actually get to know him and to know his stories. But as Gottlieb began writing this book, his grandson Sam was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, which is along the autism spectrum, making it difficult for Sam to interact with others. And so Gottlieb said that at that moment, that was when his whole purpose for writing the book changed, because he became very worried about the world in which his grandson was growing up, very worried about the world in which we live in. And so he wanted to write a book that would encourage people to understand that people are unique, that people have differences, and it's important to look into people's eyes and to see their humanity and to care. And so in an interview, Gottlieb spoke with great emotion and compassion about the kind of work, the kind of strategies that Sam and his family were engaged in order to help Sam have some social interactions. And I'm not an expert in autism or in these strategies, so if you are, I apologize if I've simplified things too much. But they talked about a strategy that they called floor time. And floor time is exactly as it sounds. It's an adult getting on a floor with a child for 20 to 30 minutes and encouraging any kind of interaction. And Gottlieb talked about how all of the family would be engaged with Sam in these moments of floor time, just to try to help Sam not be trapped within his own world of thought, but to begin to have some social interaction. There are moments in our lives, aren't there, when we feel as if the wind has been knocked out of us. And we feel so alone, so abandoned by God and by our family, by our friends. We feel like no one can understand what we're going through. When we sense that someone is experiencing that, then it's in those moments that we too can engage in what's called floor time. This is from the Floor Time Foundation, talking about how human relationships are critical to a child's development. Human beings seem to be created to learn and grow in the context of relating to other humans. The brain and the mind simply don't develop without being nurtured by human relationship. Without relationships, self-esteem, initiative, and creativity do not grow. Logic, judgment, abstract thought don't develop without a constant source of relating. And so healing from unexpected difficulties, healing from unexpected crises. If we isolate ourselves, we cannot grow, we cannot heal. But if we reach out to others and if we are able to move beyond the walls of our isolation, then healing can happen. Eutychus fell from that window, and when he woke up, he was surrounded by people. People who were worried about him, people who wanted to help him. The wind had been knocked out of him. The wind, the breath was brought back into his life. They brought him upstairs. Paul kept on preaching, but they also had a meal together. And Eutychus' life was restored. So yeah, this little character Eutychus, just a few verses in Scripture, he teaches us that it's important to do what's best for ourselves. He teaches us that as preachers in the church, we need to think about how we present the good news of Jesus Christ. And he teaches us the importance of being in relationship, and that when the breath is knocked out of us, to reach out to one another so that we can breathe once more. So just wondering, what do you think of this peculiar treasure named Eutychus? I kind of like him.